Hey everybody, welcome to the Writers in Process video series, and we're here today with Caroline Leavitt, and I'm really excited to welcome you to the series.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, and so the first thing I wanted to ask you was, after writing Cruel Beautiful World, what was your process like for getting into the next novel you were going to work on?
That's a really good question. I always have to be working on something because I can't stand that feeling of nothingness where you're just wondering, what am I going to do next? And usually what happens is when I'm on the last 3/4 of the way with my book, I start germinating a new idea and thinking about what I want to do next. So that new idea is sort of pulling me into the future. So I hadn't completely finished Cruel Beautiful World when I was thinking of my next novel. And I was writing notes about it and trying to figure it out and trying to figure out the characters. So I'm always sort of writing a novel one way or another. I have 2 more novels in my head, so it's going to be,
That's great.
I'm sort of set for the next 7 years, I think. And then I don't know what will happen.
That's great. So you take notes to get started and flesh out some characters. At what point do you dig in and start writing? Do you wait until you're...
Well, it depends. I'm a big story structuralist. I didn't used to be. I used to just believe that the muse would carry me through. And I would end up with these 800-page novels, and I'd turn them in, and my agent would say, Caroline, where's the story? It's like you handed me this big block of marble, and you haven't carved it out yet. So I had a student, I teach at UCLA and Stanford Online, who said, I've been studying story structure. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's going to take away all the surprises and all the fun. And she said, no, it won't. Just look at this. So she gave me this material from John Truby, who's sort of the story structural guru in California, and Lisa Crone, who's the story structure guru in New York. And I started to read it, and I started to say, oh wait, this is making sense to me. It was a way of thinking of the character's journey, of what kind of deep moral choices a character would make. And it was something I had never thought about. And I thought, well, I'll try it. And to my surprise, everything just exploded. All these ideas came up. I knew what to do with the characters. I knew where the story could go or should go. And that's the way I've been doing it from now on. I start to figure out the character, so I know where the character begins, where the character ends, which are usually sort of opposites, and what kinds of choices and decisions the character made to get there.
So when you're working on the structure, you do that sort of like in the beginning of the process, and then do you map it out like on paper, on cards? Like how do you deal with that?
I have these. I color coded for each character. It takes me about 6 months to map it out, and I do it using the computer. I do it using, the note card spread on the floor, and I write what is called a writer's synopsis for myself, which is usually 40 to 60 pages of.
Wow.
And it's very detailed. It's really detailed, where the characters are going, what the moral points are, how people are changing. And then I give it to 4 people who are well-versed in different things. I actually became friends with Lisa Crone, and she's really good with structure, so I send it to her. I hire her to look at it. I give it to this guy, Jeff Lyons, who's really good with plot. I give it to this novelist, Gina Sorrell, who's really good with the emotional stuff. And I give it to this brand new novelist, who is actually my niece, who's so amazingly talented. I swear I think she's really good at this because we share the same DNA.
That's awesome.
Hillary Strong, and she almost intrinsically knows what should happen. So I take all the comments of all these people and I think about it, and then I redo the synopsis, boil the synopsis down to 10 pages, and then I give it to my agent, Gail Hockman, who also is brilliant at story, and she always has a huge amount of changes. So I I go through that again and again and again, and that takes me a few months. And finally, it's ready to send to my editor. And they, of course, have changes too. So it's a continuing process. I mean, I've been working on this book that's coming out in 2020 for about 6 years now.
Yeah.
And I'm on my edits with my editor, and it's still changing. The book is still changing and layering, and that's actually the part of the process that I love the most.
Oh, that's cool. So you mentioned both plot and structure. Like, how do you view those as different?
Plot is what happens. Plot is because this happened, then this next thing happened. Plot is, this is a story about, like if you were doing Red Riding Hood, you'd say, this is a story about a young girl who has to go through the dangerous woods in order to save her grandmother. That's plot.
Mm-hmm.
Structure is, well, what's her problem? What's her inner problem that's stopping her from doing this? Well, Red Riding Hood has always been afraid of the woods because when she was 10, this terrible traumatic thing happened, and it gave birth to this misbelief that if she goes in the woods, she's going to be decimated. And she's heard all these rumors about the wolf, and she thinks he's one thing and maybe he's another thing. And her goal, her job through the story is to face all this and realize, maybe I'm braver than I thought I was. And maybe the things that I think that are true aren't so true. So structure is much, much deeper.
Right. I love that. That's wonderful. No, that's just so helpful to hear.
Good.
Yeah, no, it is. In creative writing programs, it's like, it's frowned upon to think about plot or structure and mapping things
Right.
that way. And it makes so much sense to help you
Right.
get deeper into understanding what's going on. So at what point, you do the structure and the synopsis, when do you know you're ready to sit down and write the book?
Well, after I've done the whole, 6-month synopsis stuff, then I have to do the all-important first chapter. And I believe that the first chapter is really a microcosm of the whole novel.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to have the seeds of every single thing that's going to be sort of paid off in some surprising way in the novel. And I take a really long time to do that. And I do that because I know that once I have that first chapter, the rest of the novel is going to be so impossibly difficult to write. But I'll always be able to say, well, I wrote this good first chapter. I can't give it up now. I did all this work. So the first chapter for me is sort of like a lifesaver that I cling to. And once I have that, that sort of helps me move forward. Sometimes after I do the first chapter, I try to write the last chapter, which always changes. But it's great for me to have those linchpins. So I think, well, I have a beginning and an end. I can't give up. All I have to do is the middle. And for a minute, it seems ridiculously doable until I get it. And I realize how incredibly hard it is.
That's great. So what are some of the things you do to get to know your characters?
I do a lot of structural work. I figure out what is it they want and what's stopping them from getting it. What are all the mistakes they've made in the past that have led them to this position? I usually have about 100 pages of their backstories that are for me to understand those characters. And I'm learning how to boil those backstories down to just a sentence or two so that I can figure out the characters better. I have photographs like right over there right beside my desk of all the characters. So they live with me through the whole writing of the book. And every time I'm writing, I just sort of glance over and say, oh, there's there's Stella and there's this person. And I choose photographs of them usually from Humans of New York, because I want them to look like real people. I don't want models or any of that stuff. And I usually choose them doing something. I mean, there'll be a character going like this. There'll be a character who looks depressed or angry. And those sort of things just infuse the writing. So I know them. I know them and I love them. And by the time the book is done, they're as real to me as any other person in my life.
That's wonderful. So, so we're talking about sort of their inner experience. What about, how do you go about physical traits, gesture? Like, how much do you think that weighs into creating who they are on the page?
I think a character is what they do more than what they look like or how they appear. I won't, it drives me crazy when people spend a lot of time describing a character, and it's usually when a character is looking in the mirror saying she looked at her hair and, thought about how she had highlights in it or whatever. And I always feel like, no, that's not interesting. The only thing that's interesting is if, um, of course, this is a cliche, but it would be interesting if the character goes to the mirror, looks at herself, and takes a scissors and hacks off her hair.
Right.
I mean, you've seen that a million times, so that's a cliche. So you don't necessarily want that,
Right.
but it's more the action is what defines who a character is.
I like that. So tell me something about you get the story structure, you dig into that first chapter, then what happens, like with that morass in the middle?
I start writing. I keep the 40-page synopsis next to me, and every day I circle a scene so I don't feel overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
And I jump around in it. It doesn't have to be, when I'm doing my first draft, it doesn't have to be straight through. And I try to work for 4 hours a day, and I can't do more than 4 hours, otherwise my head will explode. It's just too much work. And I think about them all the time, and I talk about the characters all the time, and it's just a really slow process. And I love it more than I hate it, but certainly there is some hate in there because it's so hard. It's so hard. It's harder than anything I've ever done.
You get the book down. What is your process for revision like?
Well, I do a lot of revisions. I listen to all the comments of my readers that I give the synopsis in the book to, and I go back and I fix them. And then what I do is I'll print out the whole manuscript in a different font so it looks different, and it tricks my brain into thinking, oh, this is a new piece of work, and I see things I haven't seen before. I'll read it out loud. I'll go through the printed out document and I'll put different colored post-its where different characters show up, so it's an easy visual to see, oh, I have a sea of red post-its for one character and only a few yellow for another. I don't have that yellow character in enough, so I have to fix that. And I'm always asking myself questions. What is this book about? And why is this book important to me? What's the question that's haunting me that this book is going to answer? And just knowing that deepens the novel for me and amplifies the whole process.
Interesting. So,
okay, so you asked where story ideas come from. They almost always come from things that are haunting me, that are really important to me, because I figured that writers are like the canary in the coal mines. We go down to the dangerous areas, so you, the reader, don't have to. And, they don't necessarily want to go there, but they want to go there through somebody else's experience. For A Cruel, Beautiful World, I was very much haunted by the idea of how I could help somebody I really loved who seemed to be struggling. And I was finding that the more I was trying to help that person, the worse I was making it for them. I was just making things miserable. So my question to myself in that book was, can you fix somebody else's problems? And I was hoping in writing the novel that the answer would be yes, of course you can, and this is how you do it. And instead the answer was no, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just have to let life wash over you and step back. And sometimes people react very badly to your trying to change them in any way. And to me, that was like a punch in the heart, but that was the right thing for the book. And, there's certain questions that always haunt me, which is how well do you know the people you love? And why don't you know them better? And is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? And I'm also haunted by, how we live our lives, what we think is a good way to live our lives, and as opposed to what really is a good way. My fears and phobias always come in. My mother-in-law actually said to me the last time I saw her, why do you always write about people disappearing or being kidnapped or whatever? Every book it's another vanishing. And I laughed even though I was sort of hurt. And I thought, well, it's because that's my greatest fear, that people will just sort of leave. And that's what I write about to protect myself on many, many levels.
That's interesting. So you had mentioned to me once about when you're developing a character, this idea of making something worse and then make it worse again.
Right.
Yeah. Talk about
That comes from Robert McKee's story structure. I don't really use his story structure, but there was one thing he said that I love, which is called the negation of the negation. And what it means is that people become their best or worst selves when things get tough in their lives. So however bad things are happening to your characters, how many rocks you're throwing at them, you want to make it worse. The prime example is always, okay, well, here's a bad situation. You're about to get married and your partner does not show up and you're left at the altar. Well, that's terrible. So you try to think, well, what would be worse? And what might be worse is you're at the altar, your partner doesn't show up, and your partner, you discover, has run off with your mom. So that's worse. And you think, well, what's worse than that? And you think, well, what if your partner runs off with your mom and they lose control of the car and your partner dies, but your mom lives and she needs a caretaker to help her. And the only person who can take care of her is you.
Oh, God.
How do you do that? And as soon as you say that, you feel that, oh, God, I don't want to go there. And that's exactly where you should go.
It's so,
So that's how you develop your characters.
it's so interesting. Great. So just a little technical question. Do you have any techniques or approaches for when you get stuck or hit a wall?
I don't really get stuck because there's always questions I ask myself, like, what do I do now? How do I do that? If I ever have a day where the writing just isn't going well, what I will do is I will go back to that first chapter and just, add little things to it just to get into the zone. But I really don't have writer's block, and I really don't get stuck because I have all these tools to sort of push me. Not to say that it's always easy, but I never sit there and think, oh my God, I can't write. I always can.
Right. And you've done all this preliminary work, so it's like you're holding the book inside you.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. So I know that you had an interesting experience publishing a book that might help new writers.
Yeah. Yeah, when I published my first novel, I had won a Young Writers Contest, and my first novel was a sensation. And I was so young and naive. I was in my 20s, and I thought, oh, I'm always going to be like this, and it's always going to be fame and glory and whatever else. And of course it wasn't. My publisher went out of business, and my next 8 novels were, I bounced around from publisher to publisher, and they were big publishers, and they never really did any publicity, and the books maybe got a few reviews. And even though they were good reviews, they weren't enough to sell books. So nobody knew who I was. I would go to a party and people would say, well, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm a writer with a question mark. So there I was writing my 9th novel, Pictures of You. And it was part of a 3-book contract for a big publisher. And the publisher called me up and said, Caroline, we've looked at this novel and we don't want to publish it. It's just not special. And I, of course, froze and said, what do you mean it's not special? Can I make it special? And my editor said, we don't think that you can. And I froze again. And I said, well, can I show you something else? And she said, no, nobody here thinks that you can do anything that we want to see. So we're just going to part ways. So I hung up the phone and I was completely hysterical, cried to my husband, cried to my agent. They all said, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Cried to all my writer friends. And one of my friends said, I just got this great new editor at Algonquin Books and I want to tell her about your book. And I said, she's not going to want to see this. It's, I was coming from a big commercial publisher, and Algonquin is smaller and literary and prestigious. I said, they're not going to want to see me. And she said, let me just try. So she did. And this editor, Andrew Miller, called me up and said, I really like this. I want to see the whole manuscript. And I said, okay. And I showed her the whole manuscript. And a week later, she called me up and she said, everybody here loves it. We want to buy it.
Oh, wow.
And I said, I have to be honest with you. I don't want to start off on the wrong foot. You have to have seen my sales figures. You have to know that I do not sell books and nobody knows who I am. And she laughed and said, oh, we're going to change that. So they bought the book. And they got that book into 6 printings months before it came out. The first month it came out, it got on the New York Times bestseller list. And I watched them, how they promoted and pushed that book. And all of a sudden, all these people who had never taken my calls before were making calls to me. And suddenly everybody wanted to know me. And I had this really strange feeling of, but I'm the same person. I'm the same person. I just lucked into a really excellent publishing company who knew exactly what they were doing. I call them the gods and goddesses because that's what they are. So the day that I was on the New York Times, I got an email from the publisher of the big publishing company which said I wasn't special enough. Only it was written to a gynecologist. And she had this really gross problem. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I just let it go. So 2 days later, she sent me another email, again to her gynecologist, where the problem had gotten grosser and worse and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, I have to be a good person and write her. So I wrote her and I said, I think you sent the email to the wrong person. I hope everything's all right. Best luck, Caroline. And she wrote me back and she said, oh, how are you? And I said, I'm doing great. I just got on the New York Times bestseller list with that book that you rejected. And she wrote me back and she said, would you like to come back to our publishing company? And I said, no. And that was sort of that. So it's sort of, but the thing that I always say is that it's actually much better that I had to wait so long to have this validation, because now I really understand fame and not fame and success and not success. And I've come to realize that it doesn't matter to me the way it mattered to me when I had my first success and I was really, really young. And I don't think it means what people think it means. To me, all that means is that, okay, I'm in a place where my next novel will be published, and that's all I care about. And maybe it will be a success, maybe it will catch on, or maybe it won't. But I'm going to keep on writing because you never know what's going to happen. And to me, that's the important thing. All the rest is sort of, it's ephemeral. It doesn't matter that much.
Right. Do you find that having had this big success has impact your writing or your approach or maybe your confidence? Has the validation mattered in the end?
No, because every book is a new book and it's always really difficult. And I'm always learning new things and I'm always in my writing process. I mean, I don't think I've cried harder over any book than the one that I'm finishing now, because there were so many things in it that I just realized, I don't know how to do this, or I have to learn how to do this particular thing better and I need a lot of help. So every book is a new thing, and I don't think I'll ever reach that point where I think, okay, I can be James Patterson and just zip off these books or hire other people to write them. It's still, and to me, that wouldn't even be fun. To me, the fun is the difficulty of it. I love that struggle. That's
wonderful. And is there anything you'd say to new writers working on their first books?
Yes, do not give up. Never ever give up. No doesn't always mean no. Sometimes when somebody says no, you can always go back and say, I've made the changes you wanted. Will you look at it again? Sometimes people are wrong. Sometimes they're just in bad moods. You cannot turn yourself into a pretzel to please anyone. And that means fans, editors, agents, whatever. You have to write the best book that you can and just keep writing, because in my experience, it's the people who keep going back to the page who succeed. It's not the ones who think, I'm going to write to the market, I'm going to write the next Girl on the Train or whatever the big book of the moment is, who don't. or who succeed in an empty way. Write the book that you are dying to read yourself.
Mm.
Write the book that matters the most to you, and that's how it will become universal.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. That's a great note.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's so nice to see you.
You too. And thank you, everyone. That's Caroline Leavitt. Be back soon.